Richard Murphy founded Richard Murphy Architects in Edinburgh in 1991. Since its inception, the practice has won 19 RIBA awards, has twice been shortlisted for the Sterling Prize, and has also been shortlisted for the RIBA Rebeccan Award. Richard is an acknowledged authority on the Italian architect Carlo Scarpa. In his spare time, he sings with the chorus with the Scottish Orchestra and pilots his Pegasus Quantum microlight around the skies of Scotland and beyond. Please join me in welcoming Richard Murphy.
Thanks so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I think I swapped with Miles, for which thank you, Miles. You forgot to mention that I used to teach here before I founded this practice, where most of you weren't born, I imagine. I was here for 4 years until I could stand it no more. And seriously, though, I enjoyed it, and I was a student here as well. But this was in the 1980s, and I'll come on to that in a moment. But when I was asked by James to choose a building or two from the World Heritage Site, I looked on the website actually and thought, well, actually in the last 21 years, we've done quite a lot actually. Those are the red dots from our website. So we were slightly, I wouldn't say spoiled for choice, we were a bit puzzled about which ones to do, because quite a few of them were in back gardens and things. But I chose one from the old town and one from the new town. I hear that this morning was pretty intellectual, so I'm going to do the counterweight to that. But going back to the 1980s, I think almost the first meeting I had with the planning official when I was having set up my own office was, and he was telling me that this hotel, which had recently been finished, was the way to do it. That was how to put new buildings into the old town. There wasn't a World Heritage Site status in those days, it was the old town and the new town. And that I should learn from this building. Well, that was kind of odd for me, because I thought then that it was a cul-de-sac as a way of approaching how to put new architecture into old places, and we can talk about that, if you like, later on. But I felt it was leading us in completely the wrong direction. And of course, while I had been here, I had been doing a lot of research and had written a book about the work of Scarpa, as been mentioned by James. In particular, I wrote a book about the Castelvecchio Museum in Verona, which at the moment, fun enough, it's funny how things come full circle, I'm now revising for a second edition, hopefully coming out in time for Christmas. And it's quite interesting reading what you wrote 25 years ago, because it was quite good. But I don't disagree with anything I wrote, actually. And I went on to write a smaller book about a smaller building in Venice, the Green Stampalia. But that experience of intensely looking at another architect's work, and in particular an architect who didn't build much, but what he did build was absolutely, in a way, completely relevant to the situation we were here in Edinburgh, which was how one can work with existing historic buildings in a creative way, and how one can place new buildings in old places. So, I'm not going to give you a talk on Scarpa, but I'll just say it was quite interesting that this, in a way, I had been exposed to this world in Italy, and this thinking, which I had thought quite deeply about, I'd like to think. And then at the same time, there was this political kind of feeling in Edinburgh that all that was totally irrelevant, and what we should do is this kind of ersatz mock medieval. So, I just thought I'd kind of whiz round quickly before we get to the two buildings. And we approach the idea of some buildings by the idea of sort of a Scarpa idea, a sort of geological idea of excavating into them and depositing layers on them. This is a building which is not quite the way it was when we left it now, because there's a new curator, and I'm sure you're familiar with it. A project which never happened down Bishop Sitzer's Close, which was to basically build on a ruin, which is a theme that pops up quite a few times in talks I give. A slightly romantic reinterpretation of medieval elements of architecture. I remember my guru, the late Izzy Metzstein, when I showed him this building, those of you who know Izzy will know his accents are unmistakable, and he said, "Richard, it's very, very Edinburgh." And I said, "Well, that's the idea, Izzy. It's too Edinburgh." Maybe speaking as the nice region that he is. It's a slightly romantic building which talks about the elements of the medieval, but hopefully reassembles them in a contemporary way rather than a sort of historicist way, vis-a-vis building up the road. And then two buildings, one seen from the other, the Cowgate Social Housing, a building with incredibly restricted budgets, as I'm probably sure anyone who knows social housing does, plus our own Tron housing, which I'll come back to in a moment. And then a very interesting project, I mean these are all sort of tucking things into the old town, and then a very interesting project which was very historicist. I almost talked about this today actually, which was actually the discovery, well not discovery, it's really pretentious, but the discovery of this, which is the remains of the old Broughton village. There's Broughton village, there's what was going to happen to it. It was going to get wiped off the face of the earth by a proposed street. What actually happened is much more interesting. I love looking at old maps and thinking what the story is. You know, you can see how these guys got surrounded in the backlands of the Edinburgh plan. It's a bit like I imagine being a farmer in Milton Keynes in 1960, suddenly waking up one morning and finding you're in the back garden of a suburban development. So that was a kind of interesting one where we deliberately built on the footprint of the buildings, and we did the anti-Newtown thing. In other words, we put the staircases on the outside, which has been a bit of a fetish of mine. We made informal spaces. So we made, if you like, a recreation in a contemporary way of a village that had been surrounded by the backlands. And then on the edges, the very edges of the new town, we had a bit of fun on the water, which is rarely addressed. We did some urban good manners right at the other end of the new town at Belford Road, a big block of a news house behind. Well, we even did a restaurant, that isn't there anymore. Well, it is, apparently it's a Thai restaurant, but I just can't bring myself to go. And then we fiddled around in people's back gardens, and then we had a little run of fun with muses, where this was probably where I hit the planner's full tilt, actually, because what people want to do in a muse is turn it into an ersatz cottage, as you can imagine. Whereas, of course, muse houses generally, well, I shouldn't use the word house, muses were places for horses and carriages, and they had a hayloft up above, which is what that is all about there. This was a lintel which would have stopped there, and that would have been an opening for the horse and carriage, and then there was a pier of stone, and then there was a door to let the pedestrian in, and up there was a window, and in behind there would have been a little kind of den with a chimney for a stable boy to kind of camp out in and no doubt had a short and brutal life. But it never, ever, ever was a house in the normal sense of the word. But of course people always think that they are houses, whereas I was quite interested in the idea of talking about a continuation of history, learning from Scarpa, so inserting the new function, which was the house, inside the shell of what I found. So that's that. And then actually, fun enough, having talked about the different scales, because the interior of the house is reversed, so the big space is upstairs as opposed to the traditional mews. We then did that in a new building on the other side of the road. And then another one again in Circus Lane. So there's a sort of canter through a few things we've been doing in the World Heritage Site. And I thought I was asked to talk about a couple of projects. So this was a competition for housing and possibly one or two other things too, run by the Coral Company, 12 architects. And I'll tell you a funny story about this actually. We were quite busy at the time, and I think the competition had to be in by Friday lunchtime or something like that. And I came into the office on Wednesday morning and I said, are we going to do this competition? Because of course we weren't getting paid, because the Coral Company was. And so the guys in the office said, yeah, come on, let's have a go. So I said, I had a doodle last night. I said, I've had one idea, and this is it. And I basically took the old town plan and went like that. And the reason you go like that is so you can get windows with proper light and proper privacy and proper ventilation and all that kind of stuff. And you get 4 flats on a plan. And I said, that seems to be quite a sensible idea. Let's draw that up. And of course, we didn't have any time to think about it, so we did. And blow me, if we didn't win. And there was an exhibition upstairs in the Matthew Gallery, and they had all 12 schemes around the wall, and then they got Janet Street Porter, who was one of the judges, to sort of Oscar-like open the envelope, and she said, and there we go, Richard Murphy Architect. So there was 11/12 of the room was immediately completely pissed off, of course. But they were even more pissed off when I said we'd only been doing the competition for 48 hours. Some of them had been at it for weeks. So I learned a lesson there. You don't spend too long on the competition. But the other thing was quite interesting. It was the only project on the wall that had a pitched roof. And I thought, I wonder if that's an absolutely obvious thing to do in the old town. That a very strange thing not to do a pitched roof. So very curious, but it's a kind of simply. I describe myself, and this may come as a surprise to some people in the audience, as quite a conservative kind of guy. I don't actually believe in reinventing the wheel. You know, I think if it's there, if there's a pattern there, and you can find a way of reinterpreting it and reinforcing the pattern of inhabitation, then why not? And that's what we did with the housing in Dublin Street to a degree, and that's what we did here, was simply to reinterpret. There was a nice little, I'll just tell you a nice little story about it. There's the competition drawing, so it's actually, for once, you know, the competition and the reality aren't too far apart from each other. There's the reality. It used to be a car park, for those of you who remember, which was on a steep slope. And you've got a few wards. And it obviously has reinvented a close which long since disappeared. And it led, in two ways actually, it led to a building which we didn't know anything about, and we ended up buying it and having our office at the end of this close. So that was a nice, happy accident. But actually, inside this building, because you've now come in at the second floor, and there's two more floors to go down to a sort of garage area at the bottom. And there was this kind of Tutankhamun's tomb inside this building. It's called the Breakfast Mission, as you know. And we didn't know what was in it in the middle of the plan. It had been sort of bricked up. So we sort of, you know, got to build the toilets out. We were hoping to find some sort of treasure or something there, but nothing like that. But what we did find was actually the old stone remains of the close, which had been knocked down, and in the Victorian times they built the brick and stone building on top of it. So we actually had a little moment of archaeological discovery, which I think was rather exciting. And then by pushing the blocks aside, we were able to make a terrace on one side and a garden at the back. Unfortunately, the flat that has the garden is on a short let, so they've never actually developed the garden. And then the guys, I've always thought in, you know, in Old Town terms, you know, if you look at the original Old Town, it was wasn't it the nobility at the top and the pigs in the basement and various gradations of classes in between. So I always think actually the guys at the top should have the best time there anyway. So there's a few sort of James Bond sort of maisonette flats up at the top there. And that was it really. And it's not terribly inventive, and I think that's why it's quite successful in my term. And whereas you don't have to be incredibly radical and come in with your big boots and do something totally different. So now for a much more tricky problem. I mentioned we built in the Old Town and the New Town, because I've never ever built on a New Town street. I mean, Deanbank Lane, kind of, but it's not really a proper New Town street. We always ended up building around the back, you know, in Mews lanes and Dublin Street housing. It's always tucked around the back where you can't see it. So I thought I would try and show you a project which is currently on site, a very small project, which actually is on a street. Here we have a few diagrams, and a few of these things have got text at the bottom. Excuse that, but I had to put together a sort of taped slideshow for councillors. So that's what they come from. And I'm sure you all know that Broughton Street is the, I think, I imagine there's some serious boffin historians in the room who will correct me, but I think it's about the only pre-Newtown lane that got incorporated into the Newtown plan. And it had a series of interesting kind of domino effects in a way. There it is. And the site that we're talking about is immediately to the east of that lane. And one of the effects it had is it disrupted the plan, as you can see. London Street lines up, but Broughton Place doesn't line up with Barony Street, and 4th Street does not line up with Albany Street. So immediately something odd is going on. And actually on the right-hand side of that drawing, the pre-existing Gayfield Square estate also compromises what happens with the Newtown grid there as well. So things become, dare I say, a bit pragmatic here compared to, say, the centre of the Newtown. On top of that, the site that I'm talking about is on the cusp, or on the interstices of two estates, the Gayfield estate and the Piccadilly estate. And they both seem to have, and I've not done a huge amount of historical research, but it seems that they both seem to have developed at the same time, around about in the 1820s. But it also seems they must have obviously done something where the Red Line went through houses to accommodate each other, but apart from that, they didn't seem to talk to each other in a Newtown planning kind of way, because some rather odd things happened, which I will explain. So there is the 19th century map of the place I'm talking about, But what I wanted to talk to you about is what the people, I forgot who it was who was laying out the new town at this time, but some of you will remember. They followed the standard pattern that had been established of a street as a little palazzo, as you know, with two corner pavilions and the central head-and section. So Broughton Place has its corner pavilion, obviously much bastardized, and so does 4th Street have its corner pavilions as the houses go around the corner. Broughton Place has its central pediment, as you'd expect, and so does 4th Street, as you would expect there. But of course they don't line up down Hart Street as a typical example here, for example, Stafford Street does to Melville Street. They actually, as you can see, misalign. So Hart Street doesn't meet either one. And what happens when the estate, Gayfield Estate, which obviously developed Hart Street, when it turns into Hart Street, then it makes good manners of a corner pavilion which goes up another floor and turns around in a formal architectural statement into Hart Street. But what we don't find at the top of the street is maybe the pediment of the centre of 4th Street for obvious geometrical reasons. But what we do find is two rather large, embarrassing gables, both of which have been altered to allow on one side for an extra floor on both sides. So where's all this leading to? Well, it's kind of leading to a think about how the new town was designed. I mean, there were, obviously, as soon as you talk about a sort of rules, then immediately there are exceptions. But I've always thought of it as kind of, and this is very crude, I suppose, of three orders of architecture, of the very large, mostly tenemental buildings, not always, but mostly tenemental buildings, which I've put on a diagram there of red, and then the smaller scale townhouses of places like Cumberland Street, Northumberland Street, etc., which are blue, and I would include Hart Street and 4th Street in that general sort of description. And then, of course, the little things, which are the muses, which I put in green. And it seems to be what's very interesting is the whole of the new town thinking is what you can see. It's all about scenery. And so it's all about the facade. And so typically in a typical, say for example, the corner of Dundas Street and Cumberland Street, because the houses are different orders, they were a little bit puzzled as to how to join them, so they didn't. So there's a gable end, which in a way is a kind of, you're just supposed to ignore that, and then there's another gable end you're supposed to ignore. But in this instance, where you had the same order of architecture, I use the word order loosely, and in this instance it goes around the corners, and as we all know, the Georgians, or the early Victorians, had differing degrees of success as to how they actually got around the corner, getting better as they got along. Whereas probably in this instance it's all blue facades, and in fact there are several examples of people going around the corner. There's one here, there's one here, there's one here, of how they managed to turn that corner. And of course what should have happened is that should have lined up with that. Even if you didn't get the alignment between the centre of Broughton Place and 4th Street, at least the building should carry on and make a continual urban block. But it didn't. And what we ended up with was these strange gables. This is obviously bastardized here, and this gable, bastardized there. But I just did a quick photo montage, which is horribly crude. I don't wish to suggest I could design a new town pediment, but just to see what it probably should have looked like, or something like that. Some event should have happened on the corner, turning the circle. So in other words, what we're left here is, dare I say, a kind of unique planning situation, which is what you might call a historical bodge. It's a mistake. It shouldn't have happened. And I've always been, we've got representatives here from Historic Scotland, and I'm always very curious as to how they deal with the history of things that shouldn't have happened, whether they should be preserved as much as things that have happened, but anyhow, or should have happened, I should say. So I found this a very intriguing problem, and I spotted a garden, or rather half a garden, which I persuaded the guy that I might get planning permission for a house for myself. And so this is a rather long historical sort of vaguely theoretical approach to why the house is the way it is, because there's sort of agendas on the go and with this house, which are quite complex. But one of the agendas is to think about how one could, in a way, resolve an unresolved planning situation, which is a happening. It's not a plan in the new town sense. As we know, the Hart Street just stops. It kind of grinds to a halt in different places on either side of the street. The street itself suddenly widens, as you can see. There you are, the street itself, a very peculiar thing that happens most un-New Town. And of course, the facades of Hart Street don't even align with the gabled ends of 4th Street. So it's all a bit of a mess, really, let's admit it. Even the Georgians and the Victorians could get even more. And on top of that, someone came along in the 1960s and converted the whole of those townhouses into one big hotel, and then plonked a mansard roof on back and front. So we then have a very unfortunate sort of situation. Of course, people living in those mansard roofs are the ones that complain about what I do, but anyhow. So probably what it should look like is something like a quick, crude photo montage again, but that's probably what it ought to look like. But it doesn't, it looks like that. And of course, that's the sort of wonderful architectural way in which that extra level was put on. So we've got not just a planning kind of cock-up, we've also got an architectural bodge as well, which is pretty poor. So how do we deal with that? And there it sits. And my solution was to say, let us try and make a bookend to this unfortunate bodge. So to take the facade and to then continue it and then to kind of ruin it, but also to build the house deliberately, not because I wanted more space, but deliberately to build it as high as possible to hide that unfortunate roof incident. There is a little, it's not a party wall situation, there's a lane between me and them, so I can't completely hide it, obviously, because I can't. In fact, somebody said to me, this is going to be the only second freestanding house in the new town of Edinburgh. This is no boffins will know others, but there's one belonging to a very old friend of mine in Saxe Coburg Square, which is the original farmhouse around which the square is orientated. But I don't know of any others. There's the one which is now divided into flats on London Street, whose name I can't remember, but all you historians will pop up with an idea. But I thought it was quite an interesting observation. It wasn't my observation. So basically, it says, well, let us take the indented ashlar of the lower floors. Obviously, I can't create an area. I can't do the junctions, the pavement. I was talking to Andrew about that in the way that the tenements did. So that's and then the smoother ashlar on the above, and then the cornice then gets taken up, and then bent down to form the bookend. So that's the basic architectural idea, and it becomes a kind of ruination of that facade, bringing you back down to the scale of the garden wall on the other side. And, well, there's lots of other agendas which I won't talk about. I'm not very green as an architect. I know that's totally kind of unfashionable to say, but I'm interested in energy issues as a means of architectural expression. And so this is actually quite an interesting experimental house in terms of how it works in terms of energy, and that's not what we're here to talk about today, but it has got a big glass roof, because that bookend, luckily for me, faces south. So there's lots of things going on inside the house in terms of moving shutters and all that kind of stuff. And that is it, really. That was my last point I made to the planners, that there were all these different kind of agendas on the go in one rather small and rather tightly packed house. And of course, I was recommended refusal by the planning department. So I did something I've never done before or since. I rang up the local councillor, who's a nice man called Mr. Dundas, which is quite nice. And we'll come full circle. And he came into the office, and I explained the whole, I took him through the whole thing that I've just taken you through in terms of the logic of how to heal what was a unique situation of a kind of planning bodge. And he saw what we were trying to do, and he said, I think you should build it. And so he chatted to his other councillors, and he said, I think you should send them things, because they're just getting all the wrong signals from the planning department. To my utter astonishment, they gave me permission, by which time the recession arrived. I couldn't afford to build it, but now I'm actually on site. I'm still not quite sure how I'm going to finish it, but I thought if I don't start, I'll never start. So it's actually on site as we speak. So those are those two projects. You see, I come back to the observation that, I mean, I'm kind of pragmatic kind of guy. I'm not a serious intellectual like, the next speaker, for example. And but I kind of do things for reasons. You know, I think you've got to have reasons for doing things, not just because you feel like it, you know, because you want to make that shape. And I think here, on both these occasions, I mean, the first one was fairly easy because the historical research is all there, it's staring you in the face with controlled housing. That was a kind of obvious solution to fall into. In fact, whenever I do a competition, I always think we've done the obvious solution and discover that everybody else has done it. You know, so it's interesting in that sense. They probably think they did the obvious solution. But here, it is, you know, quite a lot of thinking about what went wrong with new town planning and how it should have been, and how can we sort of kind of resolve a problem that was never resolved over, well, just under 200 years ago. And that's how I've tried to approach it in this instance, so you may or may not disagree. And while I was here, I couldn't help but tell you that not only is the Castle Vecchio book coming out in Christmas time, but there's a very fine, wonderful book about our last. This is what I've done since I got out of this place. So if you want to buy that, it's in all the bookshops now in our office. So I couldn't resist showing you that. Do I do questions now, James, or is that
Yes,
later?
we will. We've got a few minutes for, say, 2 questions.
Looking at your talk and also the other architecture speeches here earlier, do you think the planners and the policies, especially working in the welfare sort of, have it completely wrong as far as the need to facilitate the historic, the heritage, the built heritage that's there, rather than look at the use and the function of the space and try and integrate it with? Are our policies kind of wrong in what we should be doing as far as the architecture is concerned?
Well, you've asked a question which probably lasted 30 seconds, and it's difficult to not answer it using 30 minutes, actually. Where do I start? First of all, I start from the point of view is that, I mean, poor Oliver Barrett used to run the Program Association. He was once quoted on the front of his magazine when the famous hole in the ground on Castle Terrace was filled with the office block that now sits there, which he was very pleased with. He said, shortly Edinburgh will be finished. He was quite serious, actually. It was the idea that the city could be complete. And I've sort of whipped him with that phrase for a long time. So obviously, a city that is finished, and a city that is complete is dead. And so the question really is, you have to turn the question around, is how do we allow Edinburgh to change? That's what it's all about, because it must change. Because architecture has always reflected the society, and when it goes into aspect, then it will die as a city. And, you know, some people might say, great, we'll just have it as a museum. I mean, to a degree, Venice is a bit like that, because it couldn't change. It's stuck in its situation. But I don't want Edinburgh to be a museum. And my attitude is very, very simple, and you may think there's a slight sense of egotism about all this. I've always said to everybody, Historic Scotland planning system, Scottish government, Scottish architecture unit, architecture and design Scotland, blah, 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 blah. The best way to get good buildings, or the best way to get intelligent, creative interventions into historic places is to have really good architects, basically. You don't need to write policies and brochures of how to do it and how not to do it and all this kind of stuff. Just get really good people and put all your efforts and your energy into selecting the right people. And that seems to be, if you go to other countries, I mean, obviously Spain at the moment is on its back economically, but before that happened, you saw the most amazing interventions in historic structures, most of which would be illegal here, because they had really intelligent architects doing them. In Italy too, I mean, actually Italy, the pendulum has swung. Scarpa would never be allowed to do what he was allowed to do in the 1960s, the Castle Vecchio, but that was the lesson. You get, you know, it's quite interesting if you get a really important building, say for example, you know, the Fiat factory in Turin. You know, it's not a conservation architect it's going to, it's Renzo Piano. You know, and I think that's half our problem. That we just have to get really bright, good, well understood, well-tested architects, and that's half the problem. Trying to sort of legislate how you make these things happen. This is the point, really.
Well, let's stay on that note. Thank you very much, Richard.
Okay, my pleasure.